All right, today I have an ethical question for you, and like all good ethical questions, it's one where I can argue either side. And the interesting part of this ethical question is whatever side you feel like you're on, people will think like the answer is so obvious. It's so obviously this side or the other side. And the question is, are humans progressing? And so for this, I'm going to be showcasing one of John Gray's most controversial ideas. He's a British atheist philosopher, and he has claimed that humans are not progressing at all. So I'm going to summarize this in a few points, and I'll try to keep it brief, and then I'll give you the other side, which we're going to get from Steven Pinker, and kind of pit them against each other. And then by the end, kind of what do you think? So his first point, we're talking about John Gray here, is that the myth of progress, the myth that we're progressing towards some utopia or salvation, is a myth that we inherit from religion, particularly monotheism. So for him, even as an atheist, something like secular humanism is too religious because it inherits this idea that we get from monotheism that we're moving towards utopia, some kind of ideal way of living. And we didn't really have that idea before monotheism. Before monotheism, time was more cyclical. It would just kind of go through patterns, but we didn't have this idea that we were progressing towards something, and secular humanism is kind of hijacking that idea. So Gray argues that modern secular people have really not freed themselves from religious thinking. They've just repackaged it. And so the idea that humanity is steadily improving over time, he would argue, morally and intellectually, is not a scientific fact. It is for technology. Obviously, that's true. What he says is that this is a myth with Christian roots that's really sneaky that we have kind of inherited in Western, especially in the Western world. So in Christianity, history moves forward with this final redemption, that there's sin, sacrifice, salvation, Jesus comes. And in secular thought, it becomes ignorance. That's the problem, ignorance, moving towards enlightenment, and then some kind of secular utopia where we solve all the world's problems. And so if we strip away the Christian roots, we have to ask the question, is humanity going in any particular direction? Or are we just doing what we've always done? So the second point that he makes is that history, according to Gray, is really just cyclical. It doesn't move forward. It just repeats. So new technologies emerge, like that is true. New ideologies rise and fall. New empires rise and fall. But the core of human nature is unchanged for thousands, tens of thousands, maybe even a couple 100,000 years. We still hate people outside of our tribe. We dominate. We compete. We betray. We're superstitious. Genocide didn't disappear with the Enlightenment. It just became more efficient. The horrors of the 20th century, the two world wars, the Holocaust, the Gulag, Hiroshima, this is not ancient barbarism. These are modern ideas with modern technologies and humans doing what we've always done. Look at Trump. We're not learning. We just keep repeating history over and over, and we never really collectively learn, is what he's arguing. So in his argument is this kind of one of the foundational points is that technology changes, so it makes it look like that we're doing moral advancements, but we're mistaking technology advancement for moral advancement. So like, yes, we've made incredible gains in medicine, infrastructure, and information, but we remain psychologically fragile and tribal and anxious and violent. Our tools have evolved, but our psychology has not changed. So in Straw Dogs, he writes, this is a quote, "The human animal is not on a journey from barbarism to civilization, but on one form of barbarism to another." So every generation thinks it's the most enlightened, that we have arrived. This is enlightened. We're better than, what people used to do in the past. But what we're doing is we're just reenacting old patterns with new toys. The Enlightenment promised that reason would replace superstition and that education would eradicate cruelty. But people today believe in conspiracy theories, and we're still persecuting outsiders, and we voted for Donald Trump, for Christ's sake. Slavery still exists for millions of people, and we just kind of collectively decided that we don't care. We're still very superstitious. We're still drawn to authoritarianism. We can't even convince people today that the world is round. Like, we cannot even converge on any kind of shared reality because we are so superstitious. His fourth argument is that morality isn't evolving, it's just that the fashion of morality changes. So he challenges this idea that modern values like human rights and liberal democracy and environmentalism is like the end point of moral evolution. He sees this as just preferences, the same way that human fashion changes. So you can't look back at fashion and say like this is the correct fashion, right? I mean, it's arbitrary. So fashion just changes. And so for Gray, the shift with culture and power and circumstance is really what's going on. What we call progress is really just often a change in taste. Like it's not socially acceptable to have slaves today, but chocolatiers have said, like people know, like most people know, I feel like that chocolate comes from child slavery and literally no one cares. Like they have tried to make more expensive chocolate that is ethical and nobody buys it. Do you know what I mean? Like collectively as a society, we still don't care that slavery exists for millions of people. There's, more slavery now than when we think about the time of slavery. So he's skeptical of the notion that democracy, for example, is a moral inevitability. Democracy is very rare in history. It's also very unstable. It's being shredded as we watch when we look at politics today. It survives only under specific circumstances, and then it regresses and it fails. People assume that liberal democracy is the end point of political development. But Gray reminds us that empires, dictatorships, theocracies, these are all natural to human societies too. And we just shift from one to another as the fashion of the day changes. And so he's skeptical of also meaning making. This is his fifth point. He's skeptical of meaning making in humans, that what we call meaning is just a distraction to him. So he doesn't think like a lot of atheists, he doesn't think that there's a grand purpose to life. And he thinks that we're worse off when we pretend that there is. So in The Silence of Animals, one of his books, he suggests that other animals just simply live. They don't need a story to justify their existence. Humans, on the other hand, are constantly building narratives to distract ourselves from becoming smart enough to realize that we're going to die. And it's this little game that we play. And so his view is that the collective idea of personal progress or collective progress is just a distraction. It's a coping mechanism in the face of chaos. We feel like our lives are meaningful if it feels like we're part of a story where humanity is getting better. And he calls this essentially like a religious lie that even secular people are believing in, but it's a lie that's just helping people cope with the fact that they're going to die and that the universe doesn't care. So when people stop believing in God, he says that, he's really tough on other atheists because he doesn't think that they become rational. They just find new idols to worship, whether it's the market or the state or technology or this idea of human progress that becomes its own religion. And so just like hippos are always just kind of acting like hippos, he argues that humans are just acting like humans. There's no progress. It's just animals do what our kind of animal does. We make stories because we're afraid of death, and we play our little games, and we change our governments from time to time based on whatever's fashionable for the day, but we're not going anywhere. We're not doing it. We're certainly not changing our human nature. And so people will listen to his argument and say like, okay, like there's some points there. Like when we look at our brains, like we know that our brains are meant for a Paleolithic world that we no longer live in. And so people will say like, okay, John Gray, like if this is true, like what do we do? What do we do if we are just hippoing the way that hippos have always done? Like if we're like that, then what do we do about that? And so his argument is that that human progress is just an illusion. We're just doing our meaning games and fighting each other. We allow for these incredible gaps between the rich and the poor. We're tribal, we're superstitious. What does he say we should do with that? He doesn't offer a new ideology. That's kind of his point. That's kind of his thing. What he encourages is kind of to just live like a hippo, live a quieter, smaller life. It's not nihilism exactly. It's more just like humility, like living like animals do without delusions of or illusions of grandeur. So this doesn't mean that like you just bonk someone on the head because we're an animal. He just means like find joy in the moment, in music, in poetry, in nature, not because they lead anywhere, but because you just are, and just appreciate existence, and then you'll die. And then in this sense, he's almost like a spiritual pessimist. He doesn't think that humans are evolving towards a higher consciousness. He thinks that we're animals that are specifically burdened with self-awareness, and then we tell ourselves stories to cope. And he sees liberation not in buying into this lie of progress, but just relinquishing the need to believe that we're special and just live a simple, honor-filled, moral, humble, art-filled life and then die. And so that's kind of what he would tell you to do with this. And so he would also say that like you can reduce suffering, but he doesn't believe that the new movement to reduce suffering is going to end up any different in the end. The new king ends up being just like the old king. This is why nihilists are sometimes apolitical, is because historically the resistance becomes the empire. Like the anti-cult becomes the cult. Do you know what I mean? And so according to John Gray, we're the same as we were 50,000 years ago. We just have better technology. And this idea that like feminism has progressed, he would call that actual technology changes. It's just the fact that we have birth control. It's just the fact that we have like bottles and things like that that allow women to be able to work and own homes and things like that. That's actually a technology change, not an actual deep moral change, because it's the same that it's always been. Women's greatest power is in their sexuality. And when we look at something like OnlyFans, the only place where women are paid more than men is when women can essentially sell the currency that they've always had evolutionarily, which is their own bodies. And so he argues that everything's the same, just the technology got a little bit different, got a little bit better for women. And so he will argue with people like he will contest people like Sam Harris and other atheists that talk about progress, because he just thinks this is the new religion, this is a new illusion, this is a new myth. Instead, go live in a tiny house in the forest and live a simple, honest, good life as the animal that you are. So that's that argument. Let's now contrast that with Steven Pinker, who would argue against this in his groundbreaking book. Oh, it's in my house. I was going to bring it out here. It's a big old fat book. His groundbreaking book, Better Angels of Our Nature, is a huge volume that honestly from time to time I skimmed because I really like narrative books. And he just brought so much data to the table. So if you're very data driven, it's a very fascinating book, but I found myself like sometimes like fast forwarding through the data to get to the point that he was making. But like an insanely worthy book to read. And for Steven Pinker, progress isn't like this vague feel-good myth. It's data-driven reality. And he comes with charts and statistics and historical trends. And he has a lot of data under his belt to produce this volume. So when he says, look at any measure of human well-being, life expectancy, literacy, poverty, child mortality, homicide, war, death, discrimination, disease, when we look over the last few centuries, it's not just better, but it's dramatically better. So take something like violent death. In his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, he shows that contrary to the idea that the 19th century was the most violent in history, per capita rates of violence and war have plummeted, even if you include the 19th century. Tribal societies, he argues, were more violent than modern democracies. It's just the fact that we could see it and write about it that makes it feel like it was so much worse than it's always been. And so despite the horrors like the world wars, the overall trajectory is away from brutality and towards peace. The increase in numbers with like an atomic bomb is because of technology, when really we are overall becoming less violent than tribal societies that show more violence than like the average person walking around today. So he doesn't deny the atrocities, but he insists on zooming out over centuries to reveal a clear pattern that things get better when we apply any amount of reason, science, and human rights consistently. So where John Gray sees the Enlightenment as just another myth, Pinker sees it as a real intellectual revolution that created modern progress. And so he credits Enlightenment values, reason, science, humanism, liberty, with nearly every major gain humanity has made. Modern medicine, enlightenment. Democratic government, governance, enlightenment. The abolition of slavery, at least in the States, enlightenment. The decline in torture, capital punishment, and war, enlightenment. So in his book, Enlightenment Now, Pinker makes a passionate defense of this worldview, arguing that it's not only responsible for our material improvements, but also our moral progress as well. So it's interesting that John Gray says that it's technology first, and then that's kind of propping up this myth of moral improvement. And Pinker does it the other way around. Well, he will say that even the moral improvements that come from the Enlightenment and embracing science and reason, for example, gave way to the technological advances. So they're a bit playing chicken and egg with each other with that point. So even though Pinker admits that we're capable of violence and tribalism and cruelty, we also have the capacity for empathy and self-control and reason and moral sense. And those things can become embedded in our social norms so that we start leaning more that way rather than the more violent side of us. And so this is where he's hopeful. He argues that culture can evolve and that progress, maybe it doesn't like fully change our biology. Maybe in our biology, our brains are maybe the same as they were 100,000 years ago. But if you can put that brain in a culture that's evolved, then you'll see evolution essentially. It requires us really to build better systems. So democracy, law, education, the press, all of these things help people behave more peacefully and cooperatively than they would otherwise. So yes, we're apes with nukes, but also we're apes who invented human rights and the scientific method and the World Health Organization. So Pinker spends a lot of his time pushing back on what he calls progressophobia, which is the belief that the world is getting worse, because he's saying that the data says otherwise. And so he blames media bias because bad news gets clicks, which is a part of our cognitive biases. It's not just driven by the media. The media is the surface level of what's going on. The lower level is that our cognitive bias is that we're wired to notice danger. And so we will click on certain news that has a more negative, edge to it than we do for positive news. And so the media bias is kind of on top of our cognitive biases. So where John Gray sees atheism as empty or self-deluding, Pinker sees secular humanism as fully capable, rational, a moral system that we can build on. And he argues that you don't need religion to care about people. You don't need faith to fight for justice. In fact, he sees religion, especially when it's rigid or authoritarian, as the obstacle to progress. So his version of morality is rooted in, the flourishing of conscious beings, the science of well-being. His tools are reason, data, and empathy, just like any other atheist that you hear. And so to Pinker, the best moral systems are those that are going to just reduce suffering, increase autonomy, protect life, lean towards human thriving, and they work better when it's grounded in evidence and not revelation. So he doesn't deny that people seek meaning, but he sees meaning as something that we can build, and that, art, relationships, knowledge, service, these are all things that we can build on without God. So if Gray wants to sit kind of with the silence of animals, Pinker wants us to celebrate what's possible when humans start to think clearly and act ethically and solve problems together. And so for all of our flaws, we have actually managed to extend life and reduce suffering and expand rights and build a more peaceful global order than anything that came before. And so for Pinker, that's not something to dismiss, it's something to defend. So it's a good argument and a good book, certainly a lot of data in his book. And I, of course, would rather have the whole world be rooted in secular humanism and reason and data and empathy than religion, of course. But now that I've kind of fleshed out both sides, if you forced me to pick a side here overall, if we were to actually watch this chess match play out and this debate play out, I think John Gray makes a better argument. So Gray's central insight is that human psychology hasn't fundamentally changed. And despite, Steven Pinker's data about how societies can change, it's hard to refute this idea that actually human psychology, though, hasn't fundamentally changed. Despite material advances, our tendencies towards tribalism and dominance and fear and projection and superstition remain intact. Technology evolves, we don't. We still scapegoat. We still fall for demagogues. We still struggle with the same existential fears we've always had. So Pinker sometimes treats human nature as something that can be outgrown through education and institutions, but history suggests that those gains are fragile, and we see them more at the individual level than at the collective level. In the same way that you can see religion, or you can see individuals thriving outside of religion, but we don't see collectives thrive without some kind of culture or religion holding, or myths at least, holding people together. So the 20th century alone, the 2 world wars, totalitarian regimes, genocide, these happened in some of the most advanced societies on earth. So Gray forces us to ask, progress towards what? Like, living longer doesn't mean living better. Having more rights and choices doesn't automatically also mean feeling more secure or fulfilled. For many, modernity feels like a treadmill of anxiety and disconnection, even though we live better. The average person today, like in America, would live better than the richest kings in the past. So Pinker's charts can't capture the emotional texture of life, the rise of loneliness, the spiritual confusion, the political extremism that even happen in advanced nations. So yes, I'm going to live longer and have more rights as a woman, but I didn't get to raise my children with a village. In many ways, we've regressed as we've stopped living with nature, and how individualism and capitalism just kind of suck all the joy out of life. And so Gray's critique is existential, not just historical. The belief in progress can become a kind of civil religion. It's blinding us to the real costs of modernity, or it's making us complacent. So Pinker's vision may comfort many, but it risks downplaying systemic issues by framing them as being solved. And so in contrast, Gray doesn't offer false hope. He just tells us we're not a better species. We're still the same primate with anxieties and seeking meaning and dreams and cruelty for people outside of our tribe and longing. Don't look for salvation in ideologies. Just live a small, quiet, meaningful to you life. So Pinker wants to motivate action through optimism, and Gray kind of wants to ground us in humility through realism. Pinker is better at energizing, Gray is better at warning. And so if the goal is to understand what's actually happening beneath the surface, what makes humans tick, why we keep repeating the same things over and over, I think Gray gives a better psychological and historically coherent model. And so while I admire Pinker's defense of science and reason, Gray's case is just harder for me to shake because it speaks to something different, deeper than the data, which is like just the nature of the human condition. Now, of course, like I want to blend the two. I want to continue to lean on science and reason and empathy and the science of well-being, reduce superstition, reduce violence. I'm on board with all of that. I have talked extensively about all of that. I'm not giving any of that up. But I also don't really have hope that that's a battle that can be won, like given what humans are, given what evolution made us to be. So it's like where I end up is that I'm on Steven Pinker's team, but I think it's a losing battle because of John Gray's arguments. We really don't change. We're born scared. We may be born atheists, but we're born superstitious. We're tribal, and we're just more emotional than we are rational. We're still just as tempted to authoritarianism as ever. We're all lost in the stories in our own heads, and we're never going to be able to transcend what evolution created us to be, to create this utopia where every life on earth tends towards human thriving. So will I stop fighting for it? No. But will this movement of enlightenment win over religions or political religions or consumerism or all the other isms that fill in the vacuum when God dies? Also no. So how I balance this is like Team Pinker in my actions, but Team Gray in my prediction for what's going to happen to humanity. Like hippos are going to keep hippoing, and humans are going to keep humaning the way that we've always humaned. So that's kind of where I end up. Like, I'm going to keep fighting for the Steven Pinker side of things, that I do think that when we can break away from superstition and lean on reason and empathy, I think it's better morality. I think it's better for building countries. I think it's better for reducing suffering. I'm all about that. But do I think that that's going to just continue and get better, and that we're just going to like keep going in this direction towards progress? I don't think so. I think that this empire is going to rise and fall, and another one's going to take its place. And if it's not this God, we create other gods. Like, look at what we did with New Age spirituality. Like, we finally outgrew so many of the old beliefs that we have science to show isn't true with old religions, and then we just like start doing magic in other ways. We start doing magical thinking in other realms. We didn't really outgrow religion, we just changed religion, right? I've said that many times before. So let me know what you think here, because I could equally like argue either side. Like, if I walked into a debate, I could hop on either side of this. But if you force me to choose, I think John Gray's arguments are more persuasive for the fact that human nature just doesn't change at all. So what do you think? Is humanity progressing, or is the only thing that's progressing technology? And what is first, the chicken or the egg? Does the change in human nature allow for a change in technology? Like, does the change in morality lead to changes in technology, or does the change in technology actually fuel what looks like changes in morality? And is science actually, and is society actually progressing, or is it just changing like moral fashions, and we're just in like the fashion of the day? Like, the fashion of the day is that you probably shouldn't own a black person as a slave, but if you eat chocolate, then that's fine. Like, that's just the moral fashion of the day. So let me know in the comments. And I've been doing a ton of research, because next week I'm going to do a super deep dive. It's probably going to be over in an hour video on near-death experiences. And that's going to include like out-of-body experiences and psychedelics and what's happening to the brain at the time of death. There's a lot in there that we can debunk, and there's a lot in there that still kind of holds open to mystery. And I'm just doing a ton of research, really diving into that side of things. So next week I will do a very big video on near-death experiences, and hopefully give you enough information that you can kind of make up your mind whether you believe that near-death experiences help point us to life after death. And I think I can at least give you enough information to be able to say if that was enough to make up your mind that near-death experiences prove something, or whether you think that there's not enough information, or whether you think that there's enough naturalistic explanations that we can say that near-death experiences do not point to any kind of supernatural. So that's what I'll do next week, and stay tuned for then.